this is just relevant sites and locations in my book. If you were to use an actual map of the amount of hospitals which have come under suspicion or even something closer to direct proof that they've been involved in the organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience, the map would be completely jumbled. So these are just locations in my book. But you get a bit of a sense of the infrastructure. If we go to that other part of the map there, so we're sort of, if we go back one, you can see over there in northwest China. We'll sort of focus in on that for a minute. Okay, going back to where we were with the execution scene. So this is Xinjiang. This is Chinese word for new land. It's often called East Turkestan by the Muslims who actually are indigenous to the area. And we see a couple of locations, and we see this man was part of a team like the one we just saw in 1995. His name is Nijat, and he was the lone Uyghur in a public security bureau team of a regiment. Now in 1994, he heard from his colleagues that they had done the usual execution at the execution ground. Then they loaded the bodies into vans, and then they heard screaming coming out of one of the vans. He said, well, what do you mean? What kind of screaming? Like somebody was alive? And they said, well, it was like screams like from hell. And he said, well, there's enough sloppiness to go around. The next year, this man was in one of those hospitals in Urumqi. This is Dr. Enver Totti. And he was told to put a little surgical team together and drive to Western Mountain execution grounds. And he did. And there he was met with a scene of kind of chaos where they shot a bunch of people, and they told him to take one of the prisoners and put him up in the gurney because this man was still alive. And live organs are much less likely to cause a problem in the new host. It's a bit like cutting flowers under running water and putting it into a new vase. So he performed the operation. He took out the man's liver and his kidneys, and the blood was pulsing the entire time. The man's heart was still beating. He repressed this memory and then stood up at Westminster, where I live, London. I was giving a little thing at Parliament, and he said, I did this with my own hands. Now, I could go a lot further into some of the other doctors. There's a series of doctors. One's become sort of controversial in a way, but I think the evidence is overwhelming that as time goes on, two things happen. One is what Kilburn Modest document, which is there's a massive rise in the incarceration rate of Falun Gong, and there's a massive rise in kidney transplants. Now that's not so surprising when you consider that the first political prisoners were harvested for their organs back in Xinjiang in 1997. So in other words, after Enver Tohti did his fateful operation of a living human being, and that was a medical advance, the second medical advance comes in, because political prisoners tend to be much healthier. They're not drug addicts usually. They don't tend to have hepatitis at anywhere near the same rates. And so there was a doctor another Uyghur doctor, who was told to go take blood tests of all the political prisoners in Urumqi on behalf of 5 high-ranking Chinese Communist Party officials who had checked into a nearby hotel. They got their organs, they left, 5 more came. But you see, we're talking still about something fairly limited in 1997. These are not big numbers. With Falun Gong came huge numbers. And out of respect to one of the doctors, I'm not going to talk about him today, but this becomes absolutely clear that the majority of the organs in China start coming from Falun Gong, approximately around 2004. So then the question is not, to me anyways, and I think to you as you read the book, I think you'll find that your questions are not actually, gosh, did this happen? Did they really start harvesting prisoners? when you think about the fact that China admits that they harvest prisoners, and that all you're talking about is this one little distinction, which is political and religious prisoners, who, yes, cannot be condemned to death officially by Chinese law, because almost all of them are non-violent. Especially with Falun Gong, they don't have any violent cases. But that distinction is a very small one. It's obviously, that's a thin, thin sheet of paper. And the real question is, why? I mean, I think it's perfectly legitimate to be skeptical, because you say, why would the Chinese government, which is so rich in resources at this point, and so desperate for the attention, approval of the West and the world, so involved with the world, why would they take such a chance? And I think for that answer, you really have to go into the history of Falun Gong, and 6 of my chapters are about just that why. So I'll give you a very, very quick summary of the original reasons for the crackdown. I'm sorry, that, by the way, is the Falun Gong heartland. It starts in Chongqing, eventually ends up in Beijing. But it spreads into the countryside, and you get scenes like this all over China. In fact, from 92, when Falun Gong starts in China, to 99, you get a figure of 70 million Falun Gong practitioners. And, you know, a lot of people just stop there and say, look, these are huge numbers, and 70 million is 5 million more than the Chinese Communist Party. And I think that's right, and I think that's a huge factor. But I don't just stop there. I think it's a little further. You see that boy down there with in the front, who's sort of wearing the maybe his older brother's PLA uniform? You see, that's part of the problem, is that boys like that were growing up to be men very quickly in the PLA, and they were doing the exercises, and they were committed Falun Gong practitioners. But the most disturbing from the Chinese Communist Party perspective was this woman, was Ding Jing, who's in Toronto, and I believe in the hospital right now. And she was a coordinator. That is, she was allowed to teach the exercises to other people. Lots of people were given that privilege. She also carried a black plastic bag to pick up any trash in the park if anybody left anything, and so forth. She had 3 practice sites. The first was for China Central Television and Xinhua News Agency. So that's the propaganda arm of the party in Beijing. The second was for the PSB, the Public Security Bureau of China. This is basically the secret police. The third was for Chinese Communist Party officials, high-ranking officials, and their wives. And she even kept their identities very discreet. Now that's, from the Marxist point of view, this is very threatening. This is the Marxist template for seizing power. You go into the proletariat, you go into the countryside, you double back on the intelligentsia, the military, and you go to the leadership itself. And from another perspective, the values that people like Ding Jing were espousing, which was very much the essence of what Falun Gong was doing, was these moral values, not so much the exercises, but the values, with compassion and truthfulness and forbearance, appeared to a lot of the party types to be basically a weak China. They seemed to come from another, more traditional China, a China that could be easily dominated. At precisely the time when they were looking into China dominating the rest of the world. So the crackdown comes. But crackdowns aren't just run from the top. It requires people all across the political spectrum, all across, and in fact that's what was done, was to try to get everyone involved in the crackdown in China, successfully or unsuccessfully. This was one of the men who was involved. His name is Han. He was asked to set up a labor camp for Falun Gong women, and he did. He picked out a place called Dragon Mountain, and I'll just read something very briefly, what she said. I'll sort of give him the last word here. We got a bit close. We spent several days together, and by the end, he said this. He said, to be an official under the Chinese Communist Party, there's a precondition. If one has a conscience or a human heart, it's impossible to carry out such work for a prolonged period. He says, in the beginning, many people are like me. They have good intentions. They want to be an honest and upright official. They want to do their best for the people. But once they become officials, it's like jumping into a river. You can't go against it. You can only go with it. If you swim well, if you go with it, you'll move forward. But you see, the sky is very dark. It's about to collapse, but you can't do anything to keep